Okay, we're going to look at Horace now in his Ars Poetica, or the art of poetry. And I took him out of order with the syllabus here. As I said to you, Longinus I had on the syllabus ahead of Horace, and I'm not quite sure why I did that. I've confessed this. Other than that, Longinus wrote in Greek, and up to this point, all of the writers we have dealt with have written in Greek. But Horace is a more natural progression in terms of classical poetics, and that's what we're laying down in the early period here, before we move to the Christian era, is to say, how is poetry looked at during the Greco-Roman period? What terms of reference did they establish, and what can we see that they've passed on as a legacy to subsequent eras, because there is significant continuity there. Christians don't invent a new poetics in conformity with Christian ideals there. And if they did, it would be biblical, and there are significant problems on that front in trying to do that, because biblically speaking, the poetry of the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, and it doesn't use classical conventions as in the Greco-Roman. So it doesn't use meter, for instance, and it doesn't use rhyme. Not that the Greco-Romans do use rhyme, but they certainly use meter. Meter is a significant part of Greco-Roman poetry, and it's not of Hebrew poetry. You can see it more in the New Testament. There are some elements of classical poetics present, but it seems to me that Christian scripture is using a different model there. It's not conforming with this. Still, when the church comes along and sees poetics and rhetoric and such things as legacies of the ancient world, it by and large adopts them as its own. Doesn't try to come up with a biblical poetics per se, but just inherits this as a cultural good that it regards as good and true and beautiful, so we'll pass it on. So we left off last time, just to recap, just very briefly, with Aristotle mentioning in his Poetics, at any rate, we did rhetoric last time, but in his Poetics that tragedy was the highest form of literature, to our surprise. And he doesn't really even deal with the epic until the later chapters, so chapters 23 to 25. And but says that everything's in the epic is also in the tragedy, and the tragedy is successful in accomplishing its goal of mimesis. And this is the term I want to bring to your attention again, is this word mimesis. And it's significant in terms of classical poetics. This is the dominant form of what poets and critics poets are seeking to accomplish, and critics are determining whether they did accomplish this. And it's a Greek word translated often in English into representation. And we will see this word mimesis sometimes used simply verbatim. Many Greek and Roman terms don't have English correspondences. They're just repeated, and they become part of the lexicon of poets and critics. And so they're not even trying to distance themselves or add anything to the understanding of the ancients, but they regard the ancients' teaching on this as more or less authoritative. And so they'll use terms like mimesis and catharsis, Aristotle's words for poetry. He'll talk about the moment of recognition, when the character in a tragedy recognizes that he is the problem rather than being the solution of the problem. That's anagnorisis. Aristotle's term gets passed on. There's the hubris of the character, which we use in English, the pride often. There's the hamartia, the mistake of the tragic hero, a word that we get picked up in biblical poetics because it's used in Scripture to describe sin, hamartia, missing the mark. one of the four words used to describe sin in the New Testament. So it's a moral flaw of some sort. Although there's some question whether Aristotle just thinks it's an intellectual error and not a moral flaw. It's a little bit of ambiguity there. Critics have a debate over that. but tragedy is what Aristotle regards as definitive, and Aristotle's take on poetics becomes central to classicism. We're going to see this word classicism and classical poetics and on the course later on. In the Renaissance, in Italy beginning in the 14th century, in England probably the 16th, and so there's a significant gap in there when it has different influences in different areas of Europe. They're going to regard their endeavor to go back to the classical world. So the Renaissance is a rebirth of classical learning, and they will appeal, among others, to Aristotle, but also our man Horace today as the sort of definitive spokesman for classicism. And that becomes then the normative for certain periods. In the 18th century and late 17th, we'll have a period called neoclassicism, in which the issues that we're raising here early on in the course are repeated, and these become the model to guide poetry not written in Greek or in Latin, but in French or English or German or whatever, or Italian or any of the vernacular languages. They will still appeal to the Greco-Roman poetic tradition. So we can't go to the study of English without knowing where they get their vocabulary from. So that's the purpose of this on the course, is laying that foundation. And the core concept here is mimesis, to represent. And what are they representing when they do this? And that is one of the questions. What do we mean by representation then? A phrase used in Shakespeare, spoken by Hamlet when he's talking about the play within the play. I don't know if you recall Hamlet. You did it in high school or not. But Hamlet tells the players that they should hold it as 'twere a mirror up to nature to show her true self. And that word, holding the mirror up to nature, is a term that Horace will use. And his Latin phrase for this is ut pictura poesis, to describe like a picture. So you're to a visual image through words. Everyone, or it's very common in the psychological field, in the educational field, to describe people as visual learners. 80% of the people are visual learners, allegedly. Which might lead you to think, well, that means that my presentations have to be images. I think that most people are not visual learners in that sense. They need a picture, however, and pictures can be constructed in your mind with a clever use of language. And for me, from a Christian vantage point, I'm going to get into this more when I talk about a Christian poetics, this goes into the very nature of our own being. Because we're created by the Word of God, we understand and communicate in terms of words primarily, not pictures. And it allows us to critique, analyze, to use logic. But also, again, to communicate and to use words to paint a picture. And that's the dominant form of poetics in the Greco-Roman world, and I would say thereafter. So painting, which gets prominence in the Renaissance, is not particularly highly regarded in the neoclassical era. We don't actually even, it's not only we don't have paintings, we don't even hear much reference to painting. It's regarded as a rather menial trade. It's not even considered one of the great arts. So the seven muses, there's no muse for painting. There's for music, but there isn't one for sculpture either. We have ancient sculptures. They become the paradigms for the Renaissance sculptures of Michelangelo and Da Vinci and so forth. but they're not regarded as a high literary form in the ancient world, whereas Poetics is. And this is very interesting. And Christians in general have followed this path towards regarding painting a picture as not painting a literal picture, but rather in your mind's eye. In your mind, you can visualize this because the poet is able to use his words so that you can see what he's saying. He's not just telling you a story, you can visualize it, that because the characters come to life. Now, this becomes complicated when we get adaptations of what were originally literary documents, and then they're put into films. Because films, obviously, is more of a visual spectacle. And the question then is, what is lost in the translation? Because the aim was always to paint a picture, but when you actually do it in pictorial form, are you doing better mimesis, or are you losing something in the process? Most people who have a literary background are going to say that the process of putting something on film will lose something integral to the original work. And it was better when I read it as a book than when I saw it as a film. As good as the film might have been, it gained certain things, but now I have this image that the filmmaker has presented to me, and I can't get that out of my head, and I had a different conception here, but I can't get rid of the face of the actor now, and the way in which the lines were delivered, and the interpretation of the lines was presented. Same thing happens on stage with Shakespeare. There's a performative aspect, but then that visual aspect tends to push out the nuances of the original text. And original texts do contain nuances and actually sometimes conflicts within characters that screen actors or stage actors often miss. And that's what makes great books, among other things, is that complexity. And film is not a very complex medium. It's pretty superficial. At least that would be the understanding of the ancient world, that art, in the sense of the visual arts and the plastic arts like sculpture, are not to be regarded very seriously. So I'm just saying this to you to help you see that the framework begins here, but then there's going to be, as the ages move on, there's going to be shifts there. As I say, in the Renaissance period, painting takes on enormous significance. Not so in the ancient world. Sculpture takes on enormous significance. It exists in the ancient world, but it's not highly regarded. Aristotle doesn't think much of it at all. It's a manual labor. It's rather extraordinary, because they're so good at it that they're emulated by the great Renaissance artists, as I say, like Michelangelo. But the poets don't, and the great philosophers don't make much of it. So let's just start with that. And as I say, Aristotle's Poetics becomes the fountainhead of classicism. It doesn't deal with the epic as fully as tragedy, and it just barely touches on comedy. And some think there was a lost book of the second book of Aristotle, which he talks about writing, dealt with comedy, and he doesn't deal with it. But note that he's very happy to deal with drama. So in English literature, in general, when you do the studies in English, you will do drama alongside poetry. These are largely classically informed decisions. So we don't do film studies in literature. It tends to be a discrete subject. It's not dealt with in the classroom. Here, I might have comments to make about film adaptations. In fact, I usually do. But it's not dealt with as a serious subject within literary studies, even though it could be. It's probably determined by this as much as anything. And there could be room, from a Christian vantage point, to decide, were they correct in this determination about images and the seeming priority of the word? I would say yes. And from a Christian vantage, you could also talk about the problem of creating images. Mentioned in the book of Exodus, portraying God and so forth, images, graven images, etc. In Jewish painting, they don't even the figures have something about the figure that they're not even portraying the human image, because the human being bears the image of God as well. So there's an unrealism about the portraits. They're trying to avoid blasphemy. Marc Chagall, if you look at his paintings, if you know Chagall, I won't bother putting him up here. But his figures, their hands often have 3 fingers or something like that. And iconography in the early church is very unrealistic in its portraiture. So the pictures of Jesus don't really look like a person would. I mean, you can tell that it's a person, but it's not a very good representation if it was meant to be mimetic, as in he looks exactly like this. There's something different going on there. It's mimesis, but then what is it representing there? What is being represented? It's not a photographic portrait of the figure. That's clearly not the case, or if so, they're terrible artists, or they're terrible iconographers. So it's not that. They're representing something else. Well, what is that other thing? Well, in the case of Jesus, the divinity of him is being captured by the unrealistic portrait. We tend to privilege post-Renaissance realism. But by realism, we mean what we can see with our eyes. In the ancient world, they distrusted the eye as a way of seeing in the depths of things. This is one of the criticisms that Plato made of the Homeric poets. They see things, they see the shadows of things, but they don't see the essence. They don't see the real things. They don't really portray goodness, beauty, truth, justice. They portray instances of this, but even the gods themselves are unjust. So it's not a very accurate portrait, because they're looking at surfaces, not what lies behind them. And so Plato's criticism there in his Republic and in other places gets brought forward into the whole tradition. I don't think it goes away. There's a trust in the word as opposed to the image. I get very little sense of criticism in the Christian community of the problems of the visual medium in misrepresenting human nature. You know, you have these, it's not just that they're perfect human beings, you know, visually attractive, which is unusual, not very realistic. You know, not everyone looks like a Hollywood movie star. But the way life is portrayed is very flat. Very flat. Anyway, let me move on here. We're going to go to eventually to Horace, but let me talk a little bit about Hellenistic poetics, because there's a period here which often gets overlooked between Aristotle and Horace. Horace writing in 15 BC, his Ars Poetica, of about 300 years. And it's not that nothing happens in this period. During this period, why is it called Hellenism? It's because of Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great goes around conquering the whole of the known world. Remember, Alexander is Aristotle's pupil, and he brings Greek culture all around the known world, all the way over to India, down into Egypt, founds a city by the name of Alexandria, which becomes the place where the greatest library of the ancient world is held in Alexandria. And with it comes Hellenistic culture. So Greek culture becomes regarded as high culture, even in countries where Greece is not the main language. It becomes the literary language. And although there aren't any the same degree of great writers as we find in the Athenian period, you know, the Athenian dramatists, we get great critics. And a critical vocabulary arises out of this in Alexandria, in its library and also its museum. So it has a museum there. And what do we associate with museums? The preservation of culture that needs to be held on to and is instructive for the next generation. It is a sort of visual portrait of a past age. So the library preserves the literary features, the museum literary scholarship of various sorts. But the terms critic and criticism actually arise in this period. the Hellenistic, we would call them grammarians that come up with the terms of engagement, are the ones that first use the term critic and criticism. It's not from Aristotle, it's not from Plato, it's from this period. We still use that, to be a critic. To be a critic is now not to be, it's not a negative term. It involves, it's from a Greek word. So in English it's with a C usually, but in Greek with a K. And it comes from the Greek word krinos, which is a touchstone that can, to allow you to discern gold from false forms of it. It's a means of discernment. A critic, in other words, can judge between true and false. When it comes to the aspect of mimesis or representation, is this a true representation or is it a false form of it? So already you can see in the, even in that sense of what the critic is doing, something of the philosophical enterprise that Plato brings to bear. And mimesis then is the true copy as opposed to the false copies of it. And so there's an awareness of verisimilitude. How true to life is this? And then what do we mean by life? Once the Christian critics come along, they're going to say that human life, because we bear the image of God, has something supernatural about it, which we need to reflect also in our literature, in our art. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're in the Hellenistic period here. But so those terms, and they will regard the judgment of poems as the krisis poematon, as the capstone of their art. Krisis poematon. I'll do it with the Greek K. Krisis poematon. In other words, the judgment of poetry. To be a critic is to be able to judge poetry. What is the poem actually saying? Everyone can read. In English schools, in every school, we talk about literacy rates. They will show scores about how literate the students are, whatever, and we'll demonstrate literacy, how we'll pick up a book and read it out loud. That's not literacy. That is the beginning of what's needed to be literate. Real literacy is understanding the meaning of the words and what is being conveyed in the text. That's the sort of literacy, and it requires fluency. Being able to read in another language is not being fluent with it. I can read in other languages and sound relatively fluent and have no idea what I've just read. I don't understand the meaning of the terms. It's just noises coming out of my mouth. You just need a little bit of coaching on it, but you could sound like you knew what you're talking about. That's not literacy. It's understanding what is meant in the words, in the story. That's the sort of critical vocabulary. So the critical, the krisis poematon is the capstone of the whole critical endeavor, to understand what the poets are saying. Now you can see why this is going to bleed into another area which is a little separate from poetics but related to it, which is interpretation or hermeneutics, which you know from biblical studies. But it's just, remember Hermes, the messenger of the gods, what does he do? He tells people what the gods are telling them. He's their interpreter. He's sent down, and he doesn't, and he provides a take on what Zeus said to him, and he'll adapt it a little bit to the context. And the critic, to some degree, has this same function. He's there to point to what the poets have said, and then to explain what they meant when they said this. That's what I do as a professor to some degree. That's my job. It is not just to read the text along with you, but to try and get to what the meaning of the story is. And a good story will do that. Will have that sort of meaning. It's not just to be understood on the first take by everybody in the room. And we tend to judge stories by their simplicity often. Oh, that's good. I got it right away. And yes, it really moved me. Yes, but is there anything more to it? Are you going to read it again? No, because it was entertainment, but it didn't go, there's nothing more to it than that. Anyway, So the typical critic in this period, the neoclassical period, is a scholar who dabbles in poetry and poetic theory. And we don't have many extracts of that sort of dialogue, but it is taking there. But there are two ideas of basic importance in the development of classicism. And they were given sort of canonical form. And the first is the very term I've spoken of already, namely the term of a classic. It arises in this period. What is a classic? And they will refer to classics. It's a Roman word, by the way, but it's a Greek concept. So what is a classic? And there are certain classics, and they will list them. Here are the works you need to read. The great poets, here are their works. And to be an educated person, you need to read this. Here are the classics, read them. And secondly, the idea of genre. It's implicit in Aristotle's Poetics when he talks about tragedy and epic and lyric, which he barely touches on, and comedy, which he mentions but doesn't speak of. There are 4 different discrete genres there. But it becomes explicit in this period. Genre becomes explicit. And their belief is that all the models of poetic excellence, all of them, have already been dealt with in this period. So it's a very backward-looking view. In the sense that they want to hold on to what's good and true and beautiful in the various genres, and all the ones that could exist already exist, and it is our task to preserve that culture. And so they will then list lists or rules, canones. So there's a canon of the classics. And they'll use this word canones, which then gets passed on, a canon, gets passed on to biblical literature. Right? They talk about the canon of Scripture. What does the canon mean? It's a rule or a measure. And there are 9 lyric poets. There are 3 great tragedians. Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus. There are epic poets, and they become canonical writers. You must read these. And within each poetic kind, that is the genre, there are special rules of arrangement and subject matter and style. And there becomes a supreme model within each. So Homer becomes the epic writer. Sappho or Alcaeus becomes the quintessential love poet. Archilochus writes iambic poetry. And these are enforcing the rhetorically inspired idea of representation. Remember, Plato's dispute with the sophists was that they claimed to be teachers, charged a lot of money, and yet didn't know what they were talking about. They were representing mere shadows. Same critique that he makes of the poets. They're not really getting to the substance of things. So representation, and really then the representation of the truth, is what's at stake here. So there's a strong emphasis, and I say this because Plato sounds like he is throwing out the poets because they can't know the truth and they don't know the truth. The poetic tradition will see it more like Aristotle. Yes, they do know the truth, and they represent it in the way that is fitting to the type of literature being displayed, and it is true to life. It is true to life. Whereas Plato's understanding seems to be rather more abstract. And there's a wide variety of branches within this, and the various philosophers in this age have different takes on the neoclassical poetics. But do you have any questions about this thus far? But it's an important period in terms of establishing certain vocabulary, which will be used. And I think that that's not insignificant. and I just wanted to say something about it because it usually gets just passed over, but things like a canon, things like terms like the critic, and the idea that the essence of being a critic is to read the poetry, well, that then becomes the central plank in the classical education, is reading poetry. Reading poetry well, having a sophisticated, critical faculty which is honed by reading the classics. And it forms the bedrock of humanistic education as well. So in the humanistic period of the Renaissance, they will go back to reading Homer, Virgil, etc., many of the works that we read here at Tyndale. That's what they will regard as central to developing the minds of their students. We've not moved away from that, at least when it's humanistic education, and even Christian humanism doesn't move away from reading pagan texts. They're authoritative in their own right. What do we do when we come to Scripture? That becomes a different question and a very pressing one. Especially when we're going to assert that Scripture has an authority that even the ancients don't have. And how do they fit together then? When I taught the Bible as literature, I engaged with that a little bit. And I talked about different genres being employed and so forth. And I didn't have to deal with the problem of the canon of Scripture because that's established for me already. Here's the Bible. It's already canonical. These are the books that are approved. Are they approved on the basis of genre? No, they're approved on the basis of their authority in revealing God to people in a certain way. And it's a spiritual judgment rather than a critical literary judgment. Although as I emphasized on that course, there are strong literary features that bring out the spiritual nature of what's being conveyed in there. And the writers are highly skilled in literary ways. Just not to be judged in strictly neoclassical or rather classical literary terms. Still. So no questions. Let me move on to Horace then. So Horace is unlike the writers I've dealt with thus far, writing in Latin. He's a contemporary of Virgil. And he tends to be seen as the foremost spokesman of classicism for generations that follow, for millennia, because the language used, at least in the Western Church, is Latin. In the Eastern Church, it continues to be Greek. And so it would be interesting to study whether the Poetics presented by Horace part ways with the Poetics from the model that would be based around Constantinople. It would be an interesting study. I've seen no such study. And they effectively get cut off from one another for a significant period, and actually many of the lost works of Aristotle and Plato get brought back to Western consciousness only when the Muslims bring it with them along with all the monastic knowledge that's been preserved in the East. So then you start to get works that were not known in the West. Oh, Aristotle wrote this work. Oh, Plato wrote this work. And they're very excited to have a rebirth of classical learning in the West. So that's part of the historical complexity of here. There's significant complexity here. But Horace is regarded as the classical spokesman for classical poetics in the Latin-influenced world, which is Western Europe at this point. So I mentioned neoclassical poetics, or rather the Hellenistic period, because although most of its work is lost, it does play a huge disproportionate role of influence on this man, Horace. He is citing works that we don't know, and he's citing as basically standard understandings things that he must have gleaned from the Hellenistic period. He sounds authoritative, but when he pronounces his authority, he's not only appealing to Plato and Aristotle, he's appealing to authors that we have not read. and he's saying this is the way it is. And he's inherited that. And he transmits the influence of the the Hellenistic poetics to us. So you would almost see Horace as an expression of Hellenism. In other words, the Greek influence on Roman culture. He's the spokesman for that. So there's a continuity between the Greeks and the Romans don't really add much here. They regard the Greeks as their masters in matters of culture. They'll appeal to their sculpture. They'll even, right, as models, they will appeal to their, certainly their drama, their history, their philosophy. They'll bow to the superiority of the Greeks on this, very happily. And the literate individuals in Rome will also speak Greek and be taught by Greek teachers, reading Homer and so forth. That does not move away. So the Greece is seen as a sort of a font for classicism, even in the Roman iteration of it. And Horace, as I say, is the main transmitter of Hellenism to us. He was not Greek. He was what we would call an Italian now, although Italy didn't exist. And he had a great interest, and this will be expressed in Ars Poetica and elsewhere. He had great interest in people and also their foibles, their the sort of thing that draws the eye of characters like Dickens and Swift. He's known for his satire. He sees human folly very well. He's a famous satirist, Horace. But he's also a classicist, and these two are not strictly speaking distinct. In fact, it's during the neoclassical period in the 18th century when Swift and Pope and Johnson are writing that we see satire also flourishing. So classicism and satirical looks at life are often concurrent. So he comes to literary criticism rather indirectly through satire. Satire assumes that there is a standard of human behavior, of truth, good, beauty, justice, etc., that your contemporaries are not measuring up to. It requires their audience to recognize that for the satire to bite. So in Swift's, since we don't know Horace here probably, in Swift's Modest Proposal, he assumes that the audience knows that cannibalism is an unchristian thing to do. And it's not really he doesn't mean it when he suggests we should do this. He doesn't mean that it's the good Protestant thing to do to reduce the surplus population of the Catholics and thereby give political favor to the Protestant queen in London as opposed to the Spanish pretender. He's not serious in his proposal. He's satirizing religious bigotry and the disregard for the common human nature of Catholics and the abuse of power and so forth. He's satirizing that because he knows that his audience recognizes irony and recognizes that they ought to be behaving differently than they do. Jesus does the same thing when he satirizes the Pharisees. He's employing a understanding of human nature in which human beings know full well what justice is. So when C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man talks about the Tao and says that this moral sense is intrinsic in all human beings throughout history in the major religions, he will include Christianity in this because Jesus plainly assumes that you know when something's right and wrong. You know it. Paul asserts it in Romans 1. They're without excuse, in fact, he says, because of this. They know. And they suppress the truth and unrighteousness. But they know it. Satire assumes that you do know what's right and wrong. So Horace primarily writes in satire, and he comes then indirectly to the field of literary criticism, and it's all because he's not a very systematic thinker. So this becomes like the poetic treatment, the art of poetry, of classicism. But when you read it, it's a letter. It's a letter to a young man who wants to become a great poet. And it's not of the same sort of critique that we would expect of a teacher laying down the rules. He's not going to say there are 9 lyric poets and there are 3 great tragedians and a tragedy ought to be like this and that. He's going to present it in a more personal, epistolary fashion. He's writing a letter to a young man. And yet, what he puts in that shows us the Hellenistic inheritance of the classical world. To Paisones. Members of the Paiso family, written in dactylic hexameter. So further adding to the complexity, he's writing in a poetic form. Writing criticism in a poetic form. It's meant to be beautiful and not just persuasive and not logically acceptable. In English, we almost never have it in dactylic hexameter, let alone in poetry. It's written in prose. That's what our translation has here. There's an intimacy in tone, as it says here, and note that he uses notions that continue to frame our approach to poetry, including this one that I just mentioned already. Oh, I took it off. The ut pictura poesis. So you construct your poetry so that it presents a visual image to the mind of the audience, so they can visualize it. They don't need to visualize it. You don't need to show a picture, but you in their own minds, they create the image themselves by virtue of the words you're using. And so he says, and this is a great quote, as is, I'll just expand this so you can see it a bit more. As is painting, so is poetry. Some pieces will strike you more if you stand near, and some if you are at a greater distance. One loves the dark, another, which is not afraid of the critic's subtle judgment, chooses to be seen in the light. The one has pleased once, the other will give pleasure if 10 times repeated. And so he emphasized, and this is the word that we associate with Horace most of all, is decorum. What does he mean by decorum? You know, we use this word in English to this day. Something's not, but we don't use it very much, unfortunately. And what he means by decorum is right here. You have to join the instructive with the agreeable. You have to teach and delight. Those are the words that he's going to use. You have to teach and delight. You marry the two. So Plato's going to emphasize the truth, even though he writes often using stories and myths to persuade us. Scripture regularly uses narrative. It's the dominant mode of biblical presentation. It's not an essay. It's not a list of things to do. It's a narrative. It's a story, or it has poetic features. Furthermore, but it's conjoining what is being taught with something highly agreeable to us. It delights us. It makes us want to read it. It entices us as well as persuades us. And again, rhetoric comes into the field here then as well. So when I gave that sort of dichotomy of the 4 causes and talked about the poet and the poem and the the language used in the poem and then the audience, Horace urges us to keep the audience in mind. Or if you're a good poet, this is my advice as a critic, think about your audience. Keep your audience in mind at all times. Writers should either follow tradition or invent such fables as are congruous to themselves. So don't just invent stories. You don't have to create a new story. Use an old story. Keep telling the old stories. This is going to become significant when we come to the Enlightenment period, because the Enlightenment period is going to follow the scientific field in thinking that everything has to be new. We have to discover new things. We have to conceive of things that have never been thought or taught. So novelty becomes prized in Western culture in the 18th century, not before it. Originality is highly prized. People will talk about originality as a form of praise in the 18th and 19th century, very strong in the Romantics. We want to be original. Note that the classical spirit would never even recognize originality as something that even ought to be considered. On the contrary, you have the classics. There's a canon. Why would you want to be original? Here's your guideline. This is true, and if it's true, then it remains true. Is it good? Is it beautiful? Well, you read Homer for yourselves. Do you think Homer's worth reading? Is he not a great author? Why would you want to move away from that? It's not that you can't write new things, but you can't avoid reading the classics. In fact, later writers will often appeal to the great classical inheritance that they have when they're in their own writing. The best writers do, I think. So he's not very systematic, is Horace, but he is important in recommending teaching and delighting. And these two words, to teach and to delight, get passed on. Plato seemed to only be interested, although I think it's a slight misreading of Plato, but his strong emphasis is on teaching the truth. He's a philosopher. Poetry in general, the emphasis is on moving the audience, delighting them. Can you not put the two together? Horace says yes, and you should. That's good poetry is going to convey the truth. Take this back to a critique of film then as well. Were you entertained? Yes. Well, then you were delighted. But were you taught in this? And the answer is also yes. And what were you taught in the things you delighted in? Did you delight in corruption? The answer is usually yes. Did you delight in immoral portraits and a misrepresentation of reality? Often yes. Hence the critique in the Elizabethan period from the Puritans that what was on stage was corrupting the masses. Because they recognize that teaching always takes place, even in entertainment. You're being taught. You can't avoid these two things. If it doesn't delight us, we're not going to watch it at all. But when we do delight the audience, we have to make sure that it's married with the truth. So when Shakespeare's Hamlet says to hold the mirror up to nature, ut pictura poesis, to show nature her true self. What does he mean by nature? He means human nature. In all of its follies, as all of its grandeur. And he'll talk about all of the features of it. I'll deal with Shakespeare next semester when I teach my Shakespeare course, and we'll look at Hamlet, and I'll digress and talk a great deal about his little speech there and see what Hamlet is actually doing is appealing to Horace, but adding to it Christian judgment. But again, teaching and delighting, both are strong emphasis of classicism. Come the late 19th century, we will find a movement called art for art's sake, which is just pure aestheticism. In other words, it divorces the aesthetic, which deals with beauty, from the ethical, which deals with good. Ethic and the let's put the truth. Keats will say beauty is truth, truth, beauty. It's all you know on earth, all you need to know. Keats doesn't say it, the urn does. It's a movement towards aestheticism. It doesn't talk about goodness. It cuts it out. Keats is a great influence on Oscar Wilde, who is really the foremost spokesman of the art for art's sake movement in England. It's late Victorian aestheticism abandoned moral considerations. In other words, it's abandoned instruction with the agreeable. It's just the agreeable, but it's still instructing. But it's instructing in, I think, in ways that are deeply problematic, considered to be immoral. And art in general follows that trajectory. From the late 19th century, the Victorian period, we will follow the idea that art is basically there just to entertain us, to delight us. And it will say that it doesn't actually get involved in teaching. I don't like to be judged as a moralist. We need to remove that from art. The pushback is always, but there is no greater influence on people, particularly young people, than through the arts, through music, through what they read, what they can consume in media. It's hugely instructive. And if you deny that, you're going against the standard teaching of not just the Christian period, but the Roman and Greek period as well. They all will see this. But this is the sort of definitive statement of the classical era when he talks about enjoining the instructive with the agreeable, or to teach and to delight. We'll see it repeated over and over. Always practical. When he comes to talk about satire, or to defend his satires, he defends the genre and his right to pursue it in his own way. So he's criticized as a what we call Horatian satire against another model of satire used by the Greeks. So there is a little bit of flexibility in there within that, and a sense of innovation there. And he sees that although satire, he admits when he comes to this that it's not true poetry, he still thinks that it has a moral and useful social function. And so then he strongly emphasizes on the teaching aspect and goodness. So it's it's the mode of instruction that Jesus uses when he speaks against the Pharisees. He doesn't use Horatian satire, by the way. He uses Juvenalian satire, the Greek satire, which is scathing. Very interesting. He is blasting them. He's not making them laugh at their folly. He's making their teeth grit and want to kill them. That's Juvenalian satire. Another Roman writer, but following more the convention of satire in the ancient world. But the decorum is the main feature of this. So what is decorum? Once again, it is the conjoining of the instructive with the agreeable. That's what decorum is. Decorum, post Oscar Wilde, is aesthetic. It's a bauble. This word cosmos, you've heard of this word before. What do we associate it with? What do you associate the word cosmos with? Sorry? Universe? Yep. It has other applications to words that you certainly know, though, as well. You probably don't immediately. Well, it also means a bauble, a trinket, an ornate little decorous object, like a Christmas tree ornament is decorous. I'd say it's ornate, it's beautiful, it has a certain intricacy to it. All of those things, same with cosmetics. What are you doing? Well, you're making a woman's face shine like the beautiful heavens, right? That's what cosmetics do. It's beautifying. But is it instructing us in the truth of the individual there, or is it misrepresenting it? And there will be a criticism of wearing makeup within the church. It's not because there's anything wrong with beauty per se, it's because it's departing from the true representation of the person. That's the criticism. It's leaning into a pre-existent understanding of the importance of joining the instructive with the agreeable. So when Paul talks about not wearing makeup and so forth, he doesn't talk about makeup, but he talks about wearing your hair and so forth. He talks about representing yourself to others, and what are they focused on? They're representing on their character. This is how Sarah pleased Abraham. It's about you are representing yourself. How do you represent yourself? It's a serious practical issue. But it's leaning into a conversation that's already existing in the arts in general. And the idea of being decorous or having decorum doesn't mean just wearing the right fashion and right makeup and so forth and looking beautiful. It's wherein lies the true beauty in a person. That's the artistic issue, and it's probably the personal moral issue as well. You know, in Christian circles, some people are very harsh on this, say you can't wear makeup at all. I've heard it said, you're not a real Christian if you're wearing lipstick. Not sure what to do with that other than to say that's not really the point. Having said that, it's not that there's nothing there. There is something being said there that is of importance and worthy of consideration. If you lean down a very puritanical view, then women their faces ought to be covered in public, which is in sort of very strict Islamic teaching. Women covers their face for that reason, and more besides, but I don't need to get into that here. But Horace is going to insist on appropriateness of style and on elegance and polish, and he's going to say that comes through hard work. It isn't, you don't, in a fit of inspiration, write down everything that came into your head and leave it at that and say, I can't improve on perfection because this is exactly how I saw it. He will go back and revise and revise and revise and polish and get to the point where he is happy about the joining of the instructive with the agreeable. Yes, I like the way they put that, but does it really instruct us in the true nature of things? So the poet is intensely interested in truth, conveying of truth. It's easy to make people laugh if you use swearing. Comics do it all the time. Right? The best comics are often extraordinarily vulgar. Use subtle and not so subtle innuendo. And again, they can please people with that. But what are they doing to their audience in the process? Are you laughing at what you ought to be laughing at? Are you degraded in the degradation of another person used through the bad language? As soon as you say this, I'll be accused of being puritanical. Well, Horace is puritanical, and yet it's a total anachronism to call him that. The whole Greco-Roman tradition is by the standard of the aesthetics of Oscar Wilde, puritanical. Now, Wilde, in his defense, is reacting against the strong moralism in the Victorian period, which doesn't have the tone right either. They're the legacy of the Romantics. But I'll get off topic if I go too far down there. But the idea of hard work in order to get a sort of elegant and polished style is consistent throughout his writing. And he's going to write in very brief ways. He writes three forms primarily. He writes satire, he writes epistles like this one that we have in our book, and we also have odes. He resists the pressure of his friends to write epic or drama. And his defense of this is that it's important that the poet stick to the genre he's best suited to write. So it goes back again to the classical standards. There are certain genres. I'm not best suited to write an epic, so I'm not going to write an epic. You think I'm a great poet because you like my satires. You like my odes, you like my epistles, you think I'm good at them. I am good at them. I'm not going to try to be something that I'm not. There's great critical judgment. There's humility in this as well. In the epistle to Augustus, which we're not going to read, he adds a little to this and a little bit of nuance, because he does say there that we mustn't be subservient and involved in just blindly worshiping the poetry of the past. And it brings out two strong features of Horace's classicism, which probably are influential in later when revivals in the Renaissance and the classical period. Firstly, he thinks that Rome deserved great literature and was capable of it. So it's not just the Greeks. As much as we revere the Greeks and we regard them as the canonical authors, we have to read the Greeks. Still, we can produce our own poetry in Roman, in Latin. And that same argument will be used by Milton and the English Renaissance. Shakespeare, they'll write in English, and they'll say we don't just need to read the Greeks, we can write our own poetry. So we should be able to create our own great literature set alongside classical Greece. Secondly, he's convinced that the result will only be achieved through hard work and by imitating the classical Greek authors. So on the one hand, we can add to it, but it's a foundation that we're building on. And so classicism is progressive for Horace. The foundation can't be departed from, but we can add to it. And it's also sort of patriotic. We ought to write in our own native language. And it ought to commend itself to Roman works of literature. I might not be up to writing the epic, says Horace, but somebody ought to. Well, the somebody is Virgil, his contemporary. It's a great golden age of Latin literature in this period. And we will see the parallels in Italy and France of exactly the same thing. We appeal to the Greeks, and by then we appeal to the Romans, but we ought to also have great French literature and great Italian literature and great English literature. And we ought not to stick with only reading that. And so this is going to be the apologetic then for reading English literature. But also my insistence as the department head that we ought to be reading the classics first and always appealing to them as a standard, because I'm not wise enough to think more clearly on this than my forebears. You have to pass on an inheritance. Not authoritative enough either. Any comments or questions about this? If you read this Epistle to Pisones, it's clear that it's a poem, and it probably needs to be read as a work of art, as a poem for delight. And what you will find in doing that, you're expecting on a course in literary criticism to be looking for the instruction, and you're going to find that the emphasis is on the agreeable, but the agreeable is also teaching you. It's very witty, it's concise, it's very sharp and pointed and brief. Puts things very pleasantly. And that sort of clarity and brevity and persuasiveness is supposed to mark the classical essay. And this is the hard thing when I assign essays for undergrads and even after that, is everyone wants to know a word count. I got to meet a certain word limit. The aim is to capture the subject as briefly and persuasively as you can. And or is that if you need to, then take more time. But in general, I mean, I understand the question in a sense, but the main aim is for clarity and conciseness and persuasiveness. You're to join instructive and agreeable. You're to get to the substance of the matter, but do it as beautifully as you can. So you become a bit of a poet by being a critic. You're employing the features of poetry or drama or great literature in your own writing then, in your own critique. Note that Horace the critic is writing criticism in poetic form. We'll find that later great critics will do the same thing. Not always, but sometimes. And so there's a sort of an ideal there of the best poet also being a great critic, and vice versa. Although they often get separated into two offices, and because some poets just simply are terrible critics, and some critics couldn't write a good poem. C.S. Lewis is a great critic. I don't highly rate his poetry. I like his novels, but I regard him more highly as a critic than anything else. That's where he excels. He studied classics, by the way. That was his field of study. Greek and Roman literature. Greats is what it was called at Oxford. And from that engagement with the great literary works of the past, he then branched out and started reading English literature, which he then taught in. But he had that foundation. And then what we tend to recognize him for, in addition to his literary works, which are not highly regarded, I regard them more highly than the Academy in general, but is his critical ability, his ability to appreciate and to teach us in an agreeable way. Like he's easy to read, very persuasive, concise. Most of his essays, if you read the short essays, they're 2,000 words. It's what he would have done on a regular basis in the Oxford model of teaching. You come in, your tutor's there, he's asked you to write an essay on this. You then read your essay to him. He doesn't actually even read it. You read it out to him, so there's a performative aspect of it. He then gives you feedback. He's listening carefully, and then he pushes back and say, when you said this, do you mean? And then he tells you to go away. You need to think about this some more. Go back and write on this. Next week, come back, another essay. The essay's not even being read, and yet you're having to write it, and you remember you're having to rhetorically present it to persuade your tutor, who's looking at you over his glasses and staring you down, and you're sort of trembling, that your position is correct. So you want to please him. If you please him but depart from the truth, he's going to destroy you, because you better stick to the truth. But the point is to be persuasive. And so it's creating a model of a student who is capable of getting to the truth but persuading people. This is of extraordinary use in life. You can be a lawyer, you can be a politician, you can be business people, right? How effective and important is it to be able to persuade people that the truth is something they ought to follow? Because there's a lot of money to be made in falsehood. So they have to be good people. They want to be good, and think that it's ultimately the way in which humanity has always operated, to marry the instructive with the agreeable. That's what decorum is. We're after decorum. And that will extend not just from the essay, but to personal interaction. There's a way of doing things. You can be an agreeable person. You can tell the truth and do it in a way which is attractive. Now, you're not always going to be able to do that, because the truth, Jesus was not able to do it, so you're not going to be able to do it. People will take offense. You don't have to add your own offensiveness to the offense. The truth is offensive enough. But note that Jesus teaches in story. Occasionally satirizes, but he only satirizes the false teachers. Those are the ones he blasts. Everyone else he's pulling, them he's pushing. So there's a time and a place for it. Anyway, comments or questions, or shall I leave it off with that? something to chew on. We're going to have next class, I'm going to look at Longinus's on the Sublime, and then we'll have a little group discussion of the classical period, and we'll talk about those sorts of features, but nothing else. Okay, I'll just leave it off at that for today.